And I would like to start with a very short question to all of you, starting with Annette. And I will ask you, all of you, when was the last time you really learned something? So I don't mean just received an information or a small piece of the puzzle, but really acquired something. When was the last time, and what were the circumstances?
It's a little hard to pick just one thing, because the last 2 years of my work have been this really intense learning journey where I would say that I would consider myself transformed as a person and designer, looking back at who I was and how I practiced 2 years ago. I would say that a summary of the thing that I really learned in that time was how to create a space for imagination in a space where there is very little of it, and how to use design as a mechanism to create hope in that space. The context for that is the work that I've done at IDEO.org in child welfare. I spent 2 years working with about 30 families, parents, and youth who have all gone through the very traumatic experience of being separated from each other by a government system. Child welfare in the US technically is a system that's supposed to protect families, but it specializes in separating them. And there is plenty of data that tells us that separation is, and I think you can all relate to that, one of the most traumatic things that can possibly happen. But the system doesn't have a whole lot of tools to really support families when they struggle in ways that would keep them together, right? And we were invited into that space to work with these families to envision what could be. And as you can probably tell, even just by the description of the problem, it is enormously difficult to do that, because we're talking about potential harm that could happen to children and a lot of risk reduction, et cetera. But that work is usually done by lawyers. And those are usually lawyers who have never experienced separation, because they're not poor and they're not coming from communities of color who are most impacted by that problem. So to take that as a space for design required for me to just really question everything that I had done in the past, right? Every step of the way, we had to question, how do we form insights? How do we ask questions? What happens if trauma is present? How are we together in that space? And it really reshaped how I think about what design can do and how we need to show up with each other as designers. So learning was completely imperative. It was impossible to be and act in a way how I was used to act, right? The kinds of things that I had done when I had designed a puzzle in the past just didn't work in that space. And it created an enormous amount of realizations and learnings that I know I will take forward. And I'm quite excited about that.
Okay, thank you. Michele, I learned from you right now that teaching is learning. So when I ask you, when was the last time you learned something? When was the last time that you taught something?
Yeah, no, I tell you, it's a continuous process of learning. But you know what? That maybe today for me, is more important to unlearn than not to learn, because there are so many conventional way of doing, so many wrong attitudes that we collected in the past. And just because it's been always done like that, just because everybody does like that, just because your mother, your father, they told you to do like that, you continuously do, and it's wrong. It's wrong because in 70 years everything changed, and we cannot go on wrong attitudes and wrong behaviors just because we are used to do like that. No way. And this is the first source of innovation. We have to innovate our way of doing and look to the new generations, because the new generations, they have the seed of the changement inside them.
Okay, thank you. Gareth, when was the last time that you learned something, and under which circumstances took this place?
Well, I guess it comes back to Michele's point about making mistakes. I constantly make mistakes, so I would hope I'm constantly learning as a consequence of those mistakes that I continuously make. So I can think of a situation only this week, which I won't go into details about, but it was an important insight for me in terms of my own leadership, communication, dialogue, and on the boundary between, I guess, the individual and society and your connection and how you manage that. That's a very complicated space that is a constant learning for me, I'm sure is for lots of people. So that's the thing that immediately comes to mind is an important lesson I learned about, I guess, my own confidence and standing up for things that are important for me, but also in a respectful way to others. So that's the one, this major one for me this week.
Okay, and thank you. Gareth, may I continue with the second question to you? Because we would like to learn from you, maybe, most of us, from all of us, about learning. When do we learn at all? So what do we need? Which are the requirements? What are the circumstances? We were just talking about walking. So what do we need in order to learn?
I mean, again, following, I think dialogue, is an important part of that. I think listening, observing, doing, action are to me the pillars of learning. But then that's not just externally. It's not about listening purely to others or communicating with others or observing others or other things, but also connecting inwardly and listening inwardly to perhaps our assumptions we make, attitudes we have, conditioning we have, and that period for reflection as a consequence. So it's not just about action, but that balance between action and reflection, I think, is a very important dynamic, and that movement between these spaces in this more non-linear way, if you want, and this spontaneous way. But you must give time for that pause as well as that time for action. Otherwise, often inspiration doesn't come. Yeah.
So time is crucial. Annette, from your professional experience, something between 15 and 50 years, and when you think about the many design graduates you got into contact with at IDEO, who applied there, and some of them you accepted. What did they bring with them that was crucial for your decision? So what was it that was not taught, but what was part of their personality, and what is it that they had learned in their studies?
I would say, one thing that's important to say is that the baseline for anybody to be considered for hiring was that they could demonstrate in some ways that they had excellence in their craft. And that can mean a ton of different things, right? It's not necessarily a classic student portfolio that necessarily did the job. I hired journalists who had these really interesting articles that showed me that they had spent years looking at street names in Chinatown in New York. And that was the project they had spent 8 years on, but that told me a lot about their dedication and their craft. But that was the baseline, right? So the craft excellence had to be demonstrated. After that, we usually had several people to choose from who brought that craft excellence, right? And so the tipping point for hiring someone was always essentially the question, do I think that if I imagine this person on a team together with others, that will be a really generative group? So that's less about, do I like them, right? Do I want to be friends with them? It's kind of an important aspect, especially in the consulting field where you spend a lot of time with people and travel with them, and really just do have to have good team dynamics. But it was much more about, is there something, you spoke of emotional intelligence earlier, and I think that's really something that I often looked for. Do they have warmth, the ability to connect with others? Do they demonstrate empathy, curiosity? Can they articulate their point of view? And if some version of that was there and was present, then that usually was what would ultimately influence the decision. I will say that also one thing that you inevitably have to think about is the constellation of the team that you form, right? My team, my department at IDEO was around 30, 35 people. And so we had to think about the combination. It wasn't like a boilerplate we hire for this kind of profile, but you look at the 29 people you have, and then you think about who's the 30th person that you add in that moment, which that's always an inevitable factor. But I can't necessarily say how much of that was learned in school, which was part of your question, right? I would say that a lot of what people demonstrated as what ultimately was convincing is something that happened outside of school. It was like being really interested in underground nail art, or being active in music, or some activist work, or whatever else it was. But that was often very much happening in combination with the kind of craft that somebody brought. And so that understanding of self as a creative person, as a designer in many different ways, not just as a job, I think is probably what partly was formed in school and then partly was formed through whatever they did in their lives.
Michele, I would like to ask you the same question, but before, I would like to ask Gareth a question, and before, I would like to remind you, if you want to raise any question to the audience, not to the audience, also to the audience, but especially to the podium, then send me a message. I will receive it. Gareth, can we teach emotional intelligence?
Not easily. Not easily. On our programs, we probably don't teach it directly, to be honest. But we practice a lot, and we reflect on how things are going. So I think perhaps through the doing and reflection and the sharing, then the insight comes in terms of some of those key issues. We talk about empathy a lot as being core to designer's skill set, so we do highlight the importance of that. I do simple activities to often highlight these things, so we would talk about some of these key principles, and then I'd give them an activity and watch them perform the activity in a team. And they would all be nodding the importance of these principles, perhaps in the initial discussion and debate, but when they do the activity, they go back to type. And it's very hard, even though you might acknowledge it sort of rationally, that these are important things. It's very difficult for people to switch into that mode in reality, but only through reflection and over time, like the example I was given about my own mistakes. I think over time you gradually, I would hope, get better at those types of things. But respect, I think, is a very important thing. Respect and trust, and this can be a challenge often when people are coming from different backgrounds, is often that's not naturally there, and that can cause some challenges.
I will get to this point in a few minutes, but now the questions to you.
Yes, may I go on with, because what you say is very, it brought to my mind a sentence from a lady, an Italian lady, Rita Levi Montalcini. She won the Nobel Prize 10 years ago. She's a neurologist. And she said, what do you think we need for a better future, to find out under a neurological point of view the best conditions for the future? And they said, we have to learn. That's very nice. You have to learn that we will never be fully rational people and neither fully emotional people. If somebody say, I'm not rational, it's wrong. Because in the moment in which he says that he's not rational, he is rational. And the topic is, the problem is how to control the emotional sphere with the rational one, and how to control the rational one with the emotional one, because they cross continuously. And this has to be very clear, that you will never bring a final solution in one direction or in the other. One. You have always to mix rationality and emotionality, and this is for design is fundamental, because every product is a mix of both. And what you say about it's fantastic what you say. I'm just back from Argentina, the forest in Argentina, where I did a course of design in a school in the middle of the jungle. In the middle, it's a small city, 20,000 inhabitants, and a school with more than 100 students of design. They never know what the market is. They never know what an automatic milling system is. They don't know nothing, but they have a school of design. And they asked me to design bases to transport trees. You can imagine? But the experience was very nice. Now thinking back to this week in the forest, I have back all the emotions that we had there. But what has been the most struggling experience was that how much the diversity is fundamental. Biodiversity in the forest, in the jungle. The jungle is a wonderful reservoir of biodiversity. But in the people, because the people there is a huge mixture of local people. It's just I used to say the people in the forest. And after Italians, Germans, French, Japanese, Chinese, just a community of 20,000 people. Really, the best example of biodiversity while working together was extremely fascinating. And this topic of biodiversity is probably the best way to face the future of the world, knowing that everything we do to kill biodiversity is wrong. Everything we do to support biodiversity and human diversity is correct.
So, Michele, in order to be able to design maybe a better future, we would like to learn from your experience. And now again, the same question that I had asked Annette, same question to you. If you think back of all the persons which applied for working with your studio, working with you, what was crucial? What was it that they brought with them, and what was it what they had learned at their design studies that made you say, I want to work with you?
Difficult question, because I'm full of very different experiences. The most important stuff is to look the light in the eyes of people. If they have the eyes with the light inside, they are good people. Because yes, can be a light coming from the underground, the art or what else, but it is an excitement. Excitement is fundamental. In some way, I'm much more frightened about people that they do not have excitement, because I feel that it's a kind of depression working inside, and there's no hope, no expectations, no ambitions. And ambitions are very important to step by. Yes, another image that came to my mind, speaking about how to learn. Do you remember the peripatetic philosopher in the Greek time? They used to teach and to learn walking, because when you walk, everything looks different. After 10 steps, something that was seen from one side is totally different from the other side. You do not recognize the mountains. When you walk in the mountains, sometimes you say, but what is this mountain there? And this is the same mountain that you have seen just before. Walking is a beautiful metaphor to say that when you have to step ahead, you have to unbalance you. You have to lose your balance, because otherwise you don't go. But immediately you put the other feet on, the other leg on, and you rebalance yourself. This metaphor of walking as a real way to proceed, I think is very well working.
Okay, walking is the old practice of the Greek academies, Aristotle. Gareth, now, I want to learn from you, how do you teach trust? Because we were talking about trust, and now
that's a very good
make
question.
it as concrete, as precise as possible, so that we can all imagine what you really do.
We do a lot of group projects deliberately in our programs, partly because we believe it's quite difficult for any one individual to tackle the challenges that are faced. So this topic is at the heart of a lot of what happens in both programs I look after at the RCA. But I think trust comes from understanding of where people are coming from to some extent. And to do that, therefore, there needs to be the art of listening with empathy to people from a different background to yourself, to understand where they're coming from and why they see things in the way they see them, which might be quite different from you, which can be good because I think then you can get the diversity. So we often deliberately form teams that are quite diverse, which can put tension and not necessarily make that trust naturally there. So it therefore brings it to the fore. So we partly provoke it deliberately to raise these issues, but then encourage them to have those types of discussions to explore those issues. But I think more broadly, the way the system's been taught often, so I can only speak from the UK perspective, but the way things have been taught is it's been taught in quite isolated disciplines. And so there's a lack of understanding usually where someone else has come from and how they think and how they work, what they believe in, what they believe to be true, or assumptions that they make. And so building that trust is not easy because they have usually quite set views. I only teach at postgraduate level, and often we have students who've worked in industry for a few years before they come and study with us. So they often have quite set views, which are not necessarily ideal. So trying to break those down and build that trust is maybe through these types of mechanisms. A lot of it through practice, and again through making mistakes and creating a safe environment so that you can that. So this idea of play and playfulness, and often my colleague often used the analogy of a playground, and a playground has a boundary around it, and so there's a designated safe place to play, and that's quite important within an educational context to help establish this level of trust. So creating these types of things are a part of the things that we try and do to build that trust, but it does need to be built because it's usually not a given from the onset.
On Monday morning, I have an appointment with the president of my university, and I will propose to her that we have a course for trust, and she will ask me, okay, this is nice, what's the assignment? What's the grading? Is there an assignment? Is there grading? Are there any marks for trust?
I think indirectly there are, because if there's not trust, the work produced is usually not very good. So I think as a consequence, trust is marked, and it's probably one of the biggest barriers to me in industry was a failure of innovation was egos. And so there was not enough listening and trust of others. So yeah, I think you can simply assess it on the quality of the work, because if there's a quality, we're in a team base, which is often what we do in our programs, then that trust would have had to be there. I've seen many examples where there's very talented individuals in the team, but they haven't produced good work as a team. And trust usually the biggest, and respect are the biggest factors that break that down, and therefore they don't listen to what others have to say with empathy.
Can I draw a small...
Can I add to that? Because you were essentially asking, do you design a course about trust? And I would say, no, you don't. It can't be a course that you take, right? I would say, absolutely, you can design learning experiences that produce empathy, that produce emotional intelligence, that produce trust. That's actually very possible. But you do that by creating the conditions for that to happen, right? The way how you were describing it, you can design rituals and incentives that measure that actually look at the before and after, right, of what came off a project team, of how people actually measure their own experience of their work. Those are all things that are quite measurable, but that has to run across the design work. It's not a subject that you take, right? It's a behavior and skill and way of being and philosophy of how you understand how you are with others. And I think that's really important to not misunderstand that, because otherwise we make it something that people do to check the box, right? And I think that would be completely counterproductive in how we have to think about it, because it really is much more about identity rather than skill in that case.
I would like to draw a small triangle. I heard from you about rebellion. We know from you about creativity, and now we heard about trust and respect. So my question to you, Gareth, again is what Michele called rebellion, is this a different term or the part of creativity, and how much respect do we need and how much trust if we want to be able to teach creativity as rebellion?
I mean, yeah, that's an interesting one. I think trust is totally linked to rebellion in the sense that if I've come back to sort of creativity and that's sort of what I see creativity is doing something new, something novel of value, at least to yourself through your own learning. That might be at a simple level. But obviously, if you're doing it for the wider society, then it's value in a broader sense. So you have to doing something different. So to some extent, you have to go against the current way of doing things, almost by definition. So you have to be a bit of a rebel. I mean, my approach generally when I was, tackling projects in the past was I'd often see how people are doing it and saying, well, okay, well, I'm not doing it that way, as almost my starting point for tackling a project, because it's obviously not working, and that mindset is that group think of that way, and I need to do it differently. So coming back to the trust more in the context perhaps of teamwork, that needs to be trust. I think you said exactly, you need to go out into the unknown, and that requires trust. You need to deal with uncertainty. You have to be comfortable with uncertainty for a long period of time. And not knowing if you're going in the right direction, so that requires trust in yourself, let alone with your fellow teammates. So I think trust is actually a core part of being rebellious, and that therefore it must be driven. I guess to the point I wanted to link back to, it must be driven by this sense of what matters to you, what's meaningful to you, what's that sense of purpose. So, and the key thing of purpose is that it allows you to focus and be curious and pay attention. And one of the key practical things about creativity is attention. By paying attention and being alert and aware and sensitive to things, that comes from this enthusiasm. Without that enthusiasm comes from a sense of I'm doing something that matters to me and is important to me and meaningful to me. So I think these are all key elements of this willingness to go into this uncertain space, or going into a space that's more radical or what than is normally accepted by society. But if you want to do something new of value, you have to go there.
Okay, thank you, audience. I received a lot of questions. This is the reason why I'm at my smartphone. I'm not WhatsApping here right now. Annette, short question to you. When you think about, when you remember your design studies, and I will ask you maybe a similar question. When you remember your design studies, what was the most valuable experience today, from your point of view today, for your professional career? Was there any?
I would say presentation skills. I graduated from Köln International School of Design, which is a very project-based way of learning. And one of the ways how that was structured was that every Friday there were project presentations. So at the end of a project, you'd have to stand up in a kind of on a stage like this in a room with about 100 other students and had to present with your group what you had accomplished. That was actually terrifying because it was the mechanism how you would acquire your collaborators for your next project. So if you didn't do a good job in presenting, you wouldn't have good people who would want to work with you, right? So it was actually quite effective as a motivator. And I would say in my work, and I mean, I've worked in design consulting, I present all the time, right? You present the project brief, you present the insights, the opportunities, the design idea, you present to your team members, you present to people that you speak to as clients and partners, and that has been hugely important and not a given, as I have learned from colleagues. And it's really hard to have a team member who you cannot let present, because they may have really excellent ideas, but if they can't articulate them well and can't get them across, it's such an enormous loss. So that was actually really quite helpful to get that.
And Michele, if you remember your experience as a teacher, as a professor, what was the most valuable experience you learned as a professor for your professional practice?
I was prepared to answer to the question that you did to Annette.
So answer to the question you have heard and you liked, yes.
No, I have to say that in terms of personal satisfaction, I was very happy when I was able to drive some students to express himself. That means to look in his own individual personality, to find out its own proposal, and to be able to fight for his opinion. Is what Annette said. This was very, very satisfying when it happened. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Sometimes, most of the time, I have to say, as professor, at the beginning of the course, I see many people, many especially young ladies, crying with big tears on their eyes, because they feel this kind of desperation, not to be able to understand, not to be able to catch a concept and to make this concept valuable to do something. And the pictures of one lady, maybe 5 years ago, she was crying at the beginning, and she was so much smiling and happy at the end of the course when she presented his project. That for me was the most exciting and gratifying experience.
Okay, thank you. Gareth, what do we learn from anthropology in design matters, and what do the anthropologists do different or maybe better in their teaching at universities, in their schools?
Good question. I'm not sure I can answer directly in terms of the teaching in the schools, because I'm probably not knowledgeable enough on that particular one, but I started when I was working for Ericsson, which was back in the late 90s, working closely with anthropologists, and that was my first experience of working with them. So I was going out to understand teenage cultures in various different countries around the world in the context of what would be future mobile communication. And I was obviously predominantly a technical person, seeing the world about what technical possibilities and excite me about what might happen. But I had very little understanding of people and culture and how you could gain quite deep insights about often tacit knowledge. People, even knowledge the teenagers themselves were not fully aware of. And so you could get down to a sense of what their values were, what mattered to them, as well as obviously the practicality of their lives and insights of their daily lives and the meanings they placed on events and activities and things they interacted with and so on and so forth. So what motivated them to behave in certain ways. So I think getting down to that level of understanding beliefs and values was incredibly powerful for me, because bringing my technical knowledge into that, and I could say wonderful opportunities by gaining that additional insight. So on a very practical level, I was always amazed, and I was just often initially in the first times sitting or standing there as a bystander in some of these dialogues, and it might be last an hour, 2 hours, these types of discussions, and at the end of it you could see the person was very relaxed, the participant was very relaxed, enjoyed the discussion. They said, oh, that was a lovely discussion, typically that was, but actually the anthropologist had said nothing and told them nothing actually. But they felt it was this lovely dialogue, and I thought, wow, that's a skill that I don't have. So they obviously were very talented in using these empathic skills that we'd be talking about now. But it was very different from the individual, just putting the individual in the context of their culture, and that was a big eye-opener for me. That I realized that we needed to do more of this type of collaboration work. Ironically, in recent years, I've done work more linking with indigenous communities, and was at a workshop organized one of the research councils in the UK, where they were bringing together people from a whole range of different projects that were happening from different groups. And one of the indigenous community sort of spokespeople said, we're fed up of anthropologists just participating and interacting with us, because all they do is describe our culture, but nothing ever gets done. And we need action. And so they were saying they wanted interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches, including anthropologists, but that was not enough. They were fed up with it, basically. So it's quite interesting.
This is perfect jumping point for me for a question to Annette, transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, because of course design practice happens across disciplines, not in isolation. This is definitely one of the insights of the white book, not the only one, not the first one. Do you have an example for us, Annette, from your business experience for these types of practice across disciplines, and maybe we can learn something about this, how we teach this in design education?
I do. Before I talk about that, I want to add a couple sentences to what you said, because I think it's so important. That feedback that you got from indigenous communities about anthropologists is something that I'm very familiar with from design as well. Very often, this idea that we as designers go out and study people, and then we take these insights and then interpret them and then make decisions about what would be best for them is incredibly extractive, right? That can actually be completely flawed as a process, especially because designers as a discipline are not representative of the world, right? We are usually a much more privileged group of people, and we have no lived experience that can relate to many of the people we design for. And so what I feel really strongly about is that we need to rethink decision-making processes in design. Way too much of the decision-making and power in what ultimately gets done lies with designers. And facilitating these decision-making processes where they allow for participation of those very communities that will be impacted so that action actually eventually happens is an incredibly important part of how the discipline needs to evolve. And it's not part of practice right now in many places. So that's just one piece that I think is really important to note. In terms of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, one thing that comes to mind is I led a team working with a telecommunications provider in the US, kind of like O2 or Vodafone here, Verizon is the provider. And they came to us and they said, we want you to design an experience for middle schoolers so that they get excited about tech jobs, because that's who they hire, right? So basically the brief was, you have 35 minutes, please get 10 to 14-year-olds super excited to learn math and science. And so if any of you know middle schoolers, not exactly easy to get them super excited about math and science. So we knew we were competing with kind of like Disney and dating and other kinds of things that are excited at that age group. And the team that we put together to work on that included a former teacher turned systems designer who knew what this experience had to look like so that schools would actually invite that bus, which it would be, into their schoolyard. Because if you don't get teachers' buy-in, you're never going to go anywhere. There was a media technologist who figured out how to create a 360 surround experience that was kind of like Disney on that bus. There was a visual designer who created a beautiful brand coherent experience, but also worked together. He had some musical skills, so he worked with the Hollywood composer who wrote the custom score for the movie and the orchestra that recorded it. There was a game designer who worked with a team of 12 middle schoolers to design a game. That was co-created with a technologist from NASA and a couple of advisors from STEM, so that it would be a full, complete engineering loop that again would be signed off by the middle school teachers. And then there were 8 middle schoolers on the team that came in every week. So that's not like a typical design team, right? And nobody was able to just rely on what they usually do, because everything we did was completely different. Oh, I forgot there was an architect on the team as well, who designed the interior of the bus and then worked with a car conversion company in Los Angeles. Ask me about that later, because that was quite an adventure to get that underway. So nobody was able to rely on what they had done before, right? Nobody had done this before, this hadn't been done before, and the way how the team had to learn to communicate with each other, to bring the client along, to build this huge team of partners to produce that was really extraordinary and just required a different way of showing up. And I think that's typical for a lot of the work that we did. And I mean, that bus is on the road. There's thousands of students that have gone through it. They consistently report they're excited and they want to learn math. So it turned out well, but I think without that combination of totally different skills, it wouldn't have been possible. And that's not really how we came out of design school. I certainly didn't, right? I had much more of this understanding of the one thing that I had to do, rather than being this learning mode and constantly thinking about what is it that I can possibly add to that. And I think that that's really important to create in a learning experience and to provide that kind of sense of self to students.
Michele, I would like to, I have 100 more questions to all of you, of course, but time's running and I have to raise this question to you. And it comes with what I've heard from you, the excellence you need somewhere, somehow. Maybe this madness, this mission, this motivation, ambition you called it, together with creativity. Question about thinking with hands. So the interplay of hand and head. So this interdependence of imagination and expressiveness. What would you say? If it comes to this thinking with hands, this exchange of imagination and expression, what can be taught, what must be taught, and what cannot be taught at design studies?
Personally, I think that we need our hands. I mean, we need not only for eating or for caressing somebody, but we need our hands also to build something up. And for many years I was very, very disoriented about the topic of doing by hands and doing by automatic machine. And especially in Italy. In Italy we have in Milano we have the so-called Salone del Mobile. It's a fair, but it's a fair where all the city is participating. And there's this big discussion continuously between the big industries and the craftsmen, the artisans. And this is a continuous fight if it is better to produce industrially in high number, in a very precise geometrical qualities, or if it is better to do by hands in a craftsmanship mentality. But honestly, I think that we cannot divide automatization and machine made from handmade products. They work together in some way. When we do our prototypes that we still do by hands, using very few 3D printers and so on, we do by hands, because I feel that you can. It's easier to repair from mistakes, as you said before, because in any case you have to experiment. You experiment, and the best way to experiment is when you do something with your hands, because everything mistake you understand immediately and you repair immediately. Every mistake becomes competence, becomes something that you will never do again, or you will try not to do again. And you can make a lot of mistakes for free. In a way, you know very well, when you do a product that is wrong for some very banal reason, you make a huge damage to everybody, a huge damage to the company, a huge damage to not only to the owner of the company, but also to the people that was working there. And it's a mistake also because you demotivate people. I mean, if we can bring all our capability and need to do mistakes in the handmade product, we will save a lot of damage in the industries and in the companies.
Thank you. Here's one more question from the audience. So you have still some minutes for sending me some questions if you have. I have already asked some of them. Question to you, Gareth. Which role does the hand play if it comes to innovation and creativity?
The hand, did you say?
Yes. And do you work with hands in your innovation classes?
Yeah, massively. Making is very important, I think, for the reasons we've been touching on. And this iterative sort of feedback loop, this idea of feedback. You might have an idea of what something is, and you might put it out there, but when you create it, actually, it's probably not what you initially thought. And through that difference between what you've made and perhaps what you thought, then there's insight. And so there you learn. That's a creative step. So you have to do these things. But it was interesting for me, I did some study with artists who were painters, and I used to ask them these types of things as well. And they said to me that there's no separation between the mind and the hand. The mind is not saying, I need to do that. So the mind doesn't come first from when they're saying they're doing their best work. The hand and the mind are moving as one. So there's a total connection. I talk about in my creative work this idea of state of being rather than state of mind. And I say that deliberately because I think the body needs to be seen as part of the whole creative process. And in that making and that play, I would argue, is the natural state where there's the mind and the body links together because there's no fear of failure. There's often driven by purpose and a passion and excitement, but there's no fear of failure. So that the two work, if you say they're separate at all, but you work as a coherent whole in a cohesive way. And that, for me, is the most powerful way to create.
There's one more question to you, Michele. Have you ever had the idea of starting an academy or institute? Or can you imagine that?
Yes. Yes.
Now that you're retiring.
Yes, I'm very worried to cut my dialogue with young people, especially with young generations, and I want to find out the best way to meet in an appropriate situation, and to discuss, to dialogue with young people as much internationally as possible, and yes, and to treat all these questions that we tried to answer today, to face all these topics that are so important for designers, but also for everybody. And yes, I would like very much to do something in a very small scale, obviously, but to do something in which I bring the generation troubles in the hand, my generation troubles in the hands of the new young generation and new designers.
Annette, obviously I had a different question for you, but now this is wonderful. This really goes to you. What happens when the artifact is intangible? So talking about working with hands, what if the result or what we want to design is nothing we can touch?
I think that separation is not possible, because what I would add is that as designers, we have to work with our hands, with our head, our mind, but we also have to work with our heart and our conscience. And especially when we design intangible things, we need to find that connection. Now, we may not always be making a three-dimensional object, but even the articulating of an idea, the drawing of a sketch, or the writing, oftentimes the articulation, forming of words is also something that somehow happens through the hands. It's not a simply only intellectual process, right? I think we can all agree that writers form something with their hands. They're not just intellectual beings, right? And so I do think that separation is actually not productive to think of it that way, right? I think we always have to understand design as something that works with all of those three aspects of us as beings. You talked about that earlier, Michele, the life aspect of design. And so I do think that what's helpful is to insert making in every design process. So a lot of my design is actually quite abstract, and that always has an element of making something. There's always a moment of, well, let's just stage that, play that out, make a thing, make a model, draw a sketch, do something, right? Because I do think that really helps just move that around kind of somatically in our body. But in general, I just would never think of it as separate aspects of how we work.
What I have learned today from Angelika Nollert is that our time is limited, and we have already learned that time is important. We need to take some time to learn something, but time's up. And I have about 40 more questions. So we have to make an arrangement with this organization and continue until 11. No, this is Germany. So what I say, we have a saying in German. It says, "Wir sehen betroffen den Vorhang zu und alle Fragen offen." So we have to say that the curtain is falling on the stage, but all the questions are still open. No question is answered, and this is why we came here. We wanted to raise some very few questions, and this is why we have to work on this for the next 3 years. This is our time. So thank you for your insights. Thank you for your answers. Thank you for your patience, for your interest. And the final words go to Christoph Böninger.